Let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works. This is the calling of every believer and the heartbeat of this podcast. You're listening to Let Us Consider, where we turn to the Bible, theology, and the life of the church to strengthen our faith and encourage one another in Christ. Two scrolls were found in Jerusalem at an archaeological dig in 1979. Once those two scrolls were unrolled, which was about a 3-year process, the Aaronic benediction of Numbers 6:24 through 26 was found on those scrolls. And this is important because it predates the Dead Sea Scrolls by at least 400 years. I think that's an interesting way to start considering the story today as we come to the book of Numbers. But before we do, let me take some time to remind you to like this podcast and to follow it. And then please do comment, because that helps the podcast to get out to other people, and we want to see the spread of biblical teaching. So we come to consider the story today in the book of Numbers. And Numbers is again found in the Torah, or the Pentateuch, which are the 5 books of Moses, written between 1445 BC, which is the date of the Exodus, and 1405 BC, which is the death of Moses and then the conquest of Canaan. Numbers was probably written towards the end. Moses was probably keeping track as he went, but the book itself was probably put together towards the end of his life, because this book really does go right up almost to the end of his life. And then Deuteronomy, of course, will close out the last month or so of Moses' life, and then he goes up on the mountain and he dies. Numbers is rather a simple outline. It is chapters 1 through 25, and then chapters 26 through 36. 1 through 25 talk about the old generation, the first generation in the wilderness, and the second half of the book, 26 through 36, a little less than half, but you know what I mean. 26 through 36 speaks of the second generation in the wilderness. So chapters 1 through 25, the first generation, 26 through 36, the second generation. That is the easiest way to outline it, and it really breaks up well because both sections then start with a census. Now, as I was preaching through the book of Numbers some years ago, I was getting really kind of flabbergasted, because the book of Numbers, as you know, starts with a lot of numbers and a lot of data. And then eventually in chapter 10, you get off the ground and the story starts moving, quite literally. They pick up camp and they start moving. And then almost immediately they disobey God and camp stops, or rather camp is made. Right? The travel stops, the camp is made, and you get several sections of law. And then eventually they start moving again. The story starts progressing. You feel like you're getting some wind under your wings, and then all of a sudden it stops, and again you have several sections of law. And then eventually, again, you pick back up. The story starts going. You feel like you're getting some movement, and then it stops. And then several more sections of law. And it keeps going like this for quite a while, until the end of the book. Start and stop, start, stop, start, stop. And you start wondering, why would Moses structure the book like this? And I have become convinced that he is a genius, because by the time that you get through the book of Numbers, you feel as if you have been in the wilderness with Israel for 40 years. And so this book is rather incredible. And there are so many parts to Numbers. I don't know if I can do a really good, satisfying job to it in just a few minutes here. But let's get into the text here and consider the story. As I said, chapters 1 through 25 chronicle the first generation's experience in the wilderness. And the first 10 chapters are all preparations for that first moving out from Sinai. So chapters 1 through 10 take place at Sinai, and then in the middle of 10, it'll start moving away from Sinai towards the land. So chapter 1, you get a census of Israel, at least the men who are of fighting age. And it's a rather long, detailed account of this census. Chapter number 2, you get how the camps are arranged around the tabernacle. Remember, they had to be 2,000 cubits distance from the tabernacle itself, and then they were camped on each side of the tabernacle. You had some families on the right, some on the left, some in front of it, and some behind it. So in front of it would be to the east, and then some to the south, west, and north. And you find chapter number 3 details for you the Levites and their duties. In chapter 4, you have all the duties of the different groups of Levites, the sons of Kohath, the sons of Gershon, and the sons of Merari. All three of those, Kohath, Gershon, and Merari, all sons of Levi. Chapter 5, you get an interesting take on defilement and adultery. Chapter 6, you get laws for the Nazarites. And then at the end, the Aaronic benediction that I spoke of at the beginning. Chapter 7 has a fairly long account of the offerings that the leaders bring to Moses for the tabernacle after he finishes setting it up. And this is a rather long and repetitive chapter, really just showing that every tribe brought about the same thing. And then you get in chapter 8 another statute for the cleansing of the Levites. And you get statutes about retirement for the Levites who work in the tabernacle. Chapter 9, you get some more statutes about the Passover. And then you get a recap about the cloud, the glory cloud, coming upon the tabernacle. Chapter 10, the very beginning, the Lord commands Moses to fashion some silver trumpets, and that would be kind of the trumpets that blow the alarm to either set out or to camp or for whatever in war. And that brings us up to the end of the preparations. It's been already a long wait. And in chapter 11, you find it really has been a long wait for the Israelites. In verse 11 of chapter 10, you find that it has been a long wait for the Israelites. In the second year, in the second month, on the 20th of the month, the cloud was lifted from over the tabernacle of the testimony, and the sons of Israel set out on their journeys from the wilderness of Sinai. And so they moved for the first time. And they get a little bit on their way, and you get some details concerning all of that. But it's not very long before the people start to sin against the Lord. And they complain about him. They complain against him. Verse 1, chapter 11, now the people became like those who complained of adversity in the hearing of the Lord. Now this is instructive to us, and this is a warning to us. And when the Lord heard it, his anger was kindled. And the fire of the Lord burned among them and consumed some of the outskirts of the camp. And the people therefore cried out to Moses, and Moses prayed to the Lord, and the fire died out. And you find this a number of times throughout the book of Numbers, that as the people are moving, they start complaining and bickering, and they start rebelling and disobeying. And then the Lord, in his wrath and anger, breaks out upon them, and many of them die. And you remember then, one of the themes that has been present throughout the Torah is the nearness of the holy God and the danger of that nearness. That's what the entire book of Leviticus was concerned about. How can God dwell in our midst if we are unholy and unclean? And so you had all of the sacrifices set up. You had all of the dietary restrictions and all of the statutes for cleanliness set up, because God was in their midst, and now he's traveling in their midst to Israel, or to the land of Canaan, with them. But they're complaining against God and against Moses, and so God is mad at them. He's angry with them. They complain that they don't have enough to eat in chapter 11, and so God, in his anger, of course, he's going to supply their need, but at the same time, he judges the people. And in chapter 12, you have the murmuring of Miriam and Aaron. It's not just relegated to the people of Israel, it's also to Miriam and Aaron. And you remember that Miriam became leprous, and she was shut outside the camp for a while, and the camp did not move on until she was healed of her leprosy. And they come to Kadesh Barnea. And you know the story at Kadesh Barnea, how the Lord directed them to send out spies. And they sent out 12 spies, one from each of the tribes. These 12 spies went into the land, and they viewed the land, and they brought back word, saying, indeed, it is a good land, flowing with milk and honey. That is just very fruitful, very good. But then 10 of the spies also said, we're going to die because there are giants in the land. The Lord has brought us here to kill us. But 2 of the men, Caleb and Joshua, tried to urge the people to not listen to the other 10, but to listen to the Lord and trust in him that he would bring about what he had promised. However, the people were not willing to listen, and they listened to the 10, and they were afraid to go. And so the Lord told them, you will not go. Your children will go. You, the first generation, will die in the wilderness, and I will raise up the second generation, who right now are just babies and young children. I will raise them up, and they will go into the promised land instead of you. And so then they were doomed to walk the wilderness for 40 years. Of course, then the people got their courage too late, and in defiance of the Lord, they went in order to make war with the people of Canaan. And it says in Deuteronomy that they come chasing them as bees do. And so the Israelites fled them. So that was chapter 14. Then in chapter 15, you get everything stop. And you get law again. You get all of these different laws for the sojourner. You get laws for the punishment of Sabbath breakers. And that leads us right into Korah's rebellion in chapter 16. They're not done rebelling. That's just constantly what they were doing. Korah, the son of Izhar, the son of Kohath, the son of Levi. So of the priests, the Levites took action. And they rose up before Moses, together with some of the sons of Israel, 250 leaders of the congregation, chosen in the assembly, men of renown. And they told Moses and Aaron, "You've gone far enough, for all the congregation are holy, every one of them, and the Lord is in their midst, so why do you exalt yourself above the assembly of the Lord?" And so, really, the rest of the chapter is devoted to Moses showing that he is indeed the one that God has chosen to lead the people. And you have Korah and all of his sons and daughters being swallowed up by the earth as God makes that demonstration. That doesn't stop the murmuring. There's a plague that breaks out. And then chapter 17 also details Moses showing that God had chosen Aaron to be the high priest. And so it was Aaron's rod that bloomed. And then we get more law. Again, hard stop and law. Chapter 18, you get the duties of the Levites. You get portions for the priests. You get this ordinance about the red heifer in chapter 19. And then in chapter 20, it starts up again. And you get the death of Miriam. And Miriam died at Kadesh. And then Aaron dies at the end of this chapter on Mount Hor. In chapter 21, you get the conquering of your first people. The king of Arad, who lived in the Negev, heard that Israel was coming by way of the Atharim. Then he fought against Israel and took them captive. And so the Lord delivered up the Canaanites to the Israelites, so that they utterly destroyed them and their cities, and they called that place Hormah. And then they set out, and they start murmuring against the Lord again, saying that God's just brought us into this wilderness to die, because there's no food, there's no water. We loathe the miserable food we do have, is what they say in verse 5. And so the Lord sent fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people so that many Israelites died. And you remember the people come, they say, "Hey, we've sinned against the Lord." The Lord instructs Moses to put up a fiery serpent or a bronze serpent up on a pole so that whoever looks at that will be cured and will live. And you remember that Jesus uses that as an illustration of anyone who looks at the Son of Man who is lifted up, then he will be saved. After that, you get two victories, one over Sihon, king of the Amorites, and Og, king of Bashan. Those names appear again and again in the Torah after this, and then again and again in the rest of the Old Testament, because this is, again, just very demonstrable proof that God is in their midst, because they were able to defeat these two kings and take over all of their cities and all of the surrounding area belonging to them. So this becomes kind of a milestone moment. This is a big moment in the history of Israel that then is repeated down to the next generations for many, many generations after that. Then in chapters 22 through 25, you get what we might call the Chronicle of Balaam. You remember who Balaam was. These chapters are actually, I found them really difficult to preach, because you have Balaam and Balak, and you have to say them pretty often, pretty close to each other, and you have to keep them straight. So Balaam is the seer whom Balak, the king of Midian, calls to curse Israel. And at first Balaam refuses to go, and then Balaam does go. And long story short, you remember that on the way, the angel of the Lord met Balaam and was going to kill him because he was going for the wrong reasons. And in God's providence, God allowed the donkey to see the angel of the Lord, and twice she protected Balaam, and he was getting frustrated. And then the angel of the Lord went and stood in a narrow place where there was a pass, and as Balaam went to go through that pass, the angel of the Lord was again going to kill Balaam, and the donkey sat. And then Balaam gets really frustrated and starts cursing and hitting the donkey. And the Lord opens Balaam's eyes. Actually, first of all, the Lord opens the donkey's mouth, and the donkey admonishes Balaam, which must have been a sight. And then he sees the angel of the Lord, and the angel of the Lord speaks to him, and having quite literally put the fear of the Lord into him, then sends Balaam along his way to Balak, the king of Midian, telling him, "You are only to say what the Lord would have you to say." And so that's what he does. He goes, and 3 times Balak tries to get Balaam to curse Israel. However, every time the Lord gives him a blessing instead. I don't have time to really talk about it too much, but there is a prophecy of the Christ in chapter 24, verse 17. I see him, Balaam prophesying here, I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come forth from Jacob. A scepter shall rise from Israel. Then after that, Balaam sees that he's not going to be able to curse Israel for Balak, and Balaam, of course, wanting money, the New Testament makes that clear, tries to help Balak out. And he says, since I can't curse Israel for you, why don't you just go party with them and intermarry with them? And so that's what happens in chapter 25. Balak and his people go and they try to intermarry with the people, and the people are going to go along with it. They're sacrificing to gods, and they're going to sit down, and then they're going to do all this stuff. In fact, one of the high-ranking officials of Israel takes a high-ranking official of Midian's daughter, and he's going to go into the tent with her, and he's going to lie with her. And Phinehas, the grandson of Aaron, takes his spear and stabs them both through, presumably in the act. And then we get this very unexpected covenant made with Phinehas in chapter 25. Verse 10, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron the priest, has turned away my wrath from the sons of Israel, in that he was jealous with my jealousy against them, or among them, so that I did not destroy the sons of Israel in my jealousy. Therefore say, behold, I give him my covenant of peace, and it shall be for him and his descendants after him a covenant of a perpetual priesthood, because he was jealous for his God and made atonement for the sons of Israel. So there is a perpetual covenant. By the way, this cannot be part of the Mosaic covenant, because the Mosaic covenant was not said to be everlasting, but this covenant is. And so we need to remember this covenant when we think about all the covenants. So far, we've seen the covenant with Noah, the covenant with Abraham, the covenant with Israel at Sinai, or rather called the Mosaic covenant, and now we see the covenant with Phinehas. And that ends the first section of Numbers. So that then we get into the second section in chapters 26 through 36. Rather quickly, you get a new generation, a census of this new generation. You get a whole bunch of laws about inheritance in chapter 27. The daughters of Zelophehad. He had 5 daughters, and he had no sons. And so the question was, if the land is supposed to be passed down from father to sons, and then to sons, and then to sons, and then to sons, what happens if there is a generation where there are no sons, such as Zelophehad, who had no sons? And the law then is put in that the land will always belong to that family, so it will pass down to the daughters if there are no sons. Keep these daughters of Zelophehad in mind. They appear at the end of the book as well. You have the instruction of Joshua to succeed Moses at the end of 27. More laws in chapter 28 to do with the offerings. Laws for the 7th month in chapter 29. Laws about vows in chapter 30. Chapter 31, you pick up the story again, and you see the slaughter of Midian by Israel because of what they had done. And in fact, God told Moses this would be the last thing that you do, because then you're going to climb that mountain over there and you're going to die. And then you have in chapter 32, Reuben and Gad decide to settle there in those cities that they've conquered and not cross into Canaan and take that land as God had promised, but rather they asked, would it be okay if this was our inheritance? And God said, yes, you may settle here as long as you go over into the land and help your brothers conquer that land. And so you get 2.5 tribes staying over on the Transjordan area. That is Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh settling there. And then you get into chapter 33 and you get more laws. Actually, chapter 20 or 33 has this long list of the places that they stayed. And then you get more laws at the end. Then chapter 34, instructions for how the land of Canaan was to be divided among all the tribes. And then you have a list of cities that they were set apart for the Levites, and a list of cities that there would be for refuge, that is for somebody who committed an accidental crime like a manslaughter. They could go to one of those 6 cities in the land, and they could find refuge until the death of the high priest. And then chapter 36, the daughters of Zelophehad make their appearance again, as I said they would, and actually it's not the daughters who come this time, but rather it's the heads of the father's households of all of the families there that come and they ask for clarification. Well, what if these daughters, what if one of them, or all of them, or however many of them, what if they marry somebody from a different tribe? Will that tribe then possess this land that was supposed to be for this tribe? And Moses answers, no, this land will always be part of the tribe to which it is apportioned. And so you see that God has brought the people right up to the cusp of the promised land. In the book of Deuteronomy, they're going to be standing in the fields of Moab, in view of the promised land where they're going to be heading, and Moses is going to preach some sermons to them. But Moses cannot himself enter into the promised land because of his own disobedience. He struck the rock when he was only supposed to speak to the rock. And so God told him, you will die in this wilderness too. You will not enter into the promised land, but you will see it from afar. And so God takes him up on a mountain, and he sees the land, and he dies there. And then Joshua is raised up to take the people into the land. We'll see that on the next episodes of Considering the Story. Thank you for listening to Let Us Consider. If this podcast has been a blessing, please subscribe and leave a review. It helps others discover the truth of God's Word. Until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you.